The winter wind was sharp that morning, cutting through the silence of the streets like an invisible blade. The sun had barely risen, and a pale light bathed the empty road in a soft golden hue. A little boy stood near the corner of an old marketplace, shivering in a thin, oversized t-shirt that barely covered his frail body. He clutched the handles of a small, rusty bicycle that had clearly been loved for a long time but was now too small and too broken to bring anyone joy. His dark eyes, filled not with childish mischief but with a quiet, aching desperation, followed every passing vehicle like someone searching for a miracle. And then, in a trembling voice that cracked with hunger and hope, he whispered to a group of passing bikers, "Buy my bike, sir. Mommy hasn't eaten in 2 days." This was not just a sale. This was survival. Sparkles, before we continue, if you believe kindness can change the world, please like, comment, share, and subscribe to Stars of Kindness. Your support helps spread real stories that touch hearts. Sparkles. The bikers slowed down, the sound of their engines echoing in the stillness of the morning. They were a group of young men on their way to a weekend ride, laughing, wearing matching jackets, the kind who loved the road and their brotherhood. None of them had expected that their journey that day would lead them to a small boy with tear-streaked cheeks, standing in the cold with nothing but a broken bike and a silent cry for help. His name was Rafi. He was just 8 years old, but life had carved years into his little soul. His mother, Amna, had fallen ill after losing her job at a local garment factory. The small room they called home was slowly emptying. First, the small TV had been sold, then his mother's gold earrings, then the last pieces of furniture. What remained was a mattress, a blanket too thin for winter, and a mother who was too weak to even sit up that morning. 2 days had passed since she had last eaten. Rafi had shared the last dry piece of bread with her, pretending he wasn't hungry so she'd eat. But she didn't. She had pushed it back toward him and whispered with cracked lips, "You're the future, beta, you eat." He had eaten, not out of hunger, but out of fear, because he didn't know how else to make her smile. The rusty bicycle was all that was left. It had once been a gift from his late father, a memory wrapped in metal and wheels. It was more than a toy, it was a piece of his father's laughter. But hunger is a cruel teacher. It doesn't ask what you love. It only asks what you're willing to lose to survive. That morning, with small hands numb from cold, Rafi wheeled the bike to the road. He had no idea how much it was worth, nor did he care. All he wanted was to buy his mother a little bread, maybe some milk, something, anything, to keep her alive. The bikers parked near him, their heavy boots making soft thuds on the road as they approached. They saw the desperation in his eyes before they even heard his voice again. His lips trembled as he repeated, "Please, sir, buy my bike." Rafi's story had begun long before that winter morning. His father had been a construction worker, a strong man with warm hands and a laugh that could fill their tiny home. When he died in an accident 2 years earlier, the world had gone silent for Amna. She fought for months to hold their lives together, working long hours at the factory, often skipping meals so Rafi could eat. But fate had its own storm to throw at her. One day, she fainted at work. The doctors told her she had developed severe anemia and needed treatment she couldn't afford. Slowly, her body grew weaker, her steps slower. And the world, as it often does to the poor, looked away. Rafi had become her only soldier. He would fetch water, run errands, and try to make her smile with stories. He didn't understand everything, but he understood pain. He understood what it meant to hear his mother's stomach growl in the night while she pretended to sleep. On the morning he decided to sell his bike, he quietly covered her with the thin blanket, brushed her hair back gently, and whispered, "I'll bring food today, Mama. Promise." Then he walked out, his small shoulders carrying a weight far too big for an 8-year-old child. The market was still waking up. Shopkeepers were pulling up shutters. The smell of hot tea from a roadside stall filled the air, making his stomach twist. He ignored it. He waited near the roadside because he knew people with money passed by on big bikes and shiny cars. He had rehearsed what he would say in his head. "Buy my bike, sir. It's good. I just need some money." But when the time came, his throat felt tight. His heart pounded in his ears. And then, like a quiet prayer being answered, the roar of motorcycles approached. The bikers, leader, Faisal, a tall man in his early 30s with a tough exterior, removed his helmet. He had grown up in the same city but in a different world. He knew poverty, but it had been years since he'd looked it in the eye like this. He stared at the boy, at the thin arms holding that little bike, at the eyes that were too tired to be a child's eyes. Something in him softened. A memory, perhaps, of his own childhood when a stranger had once bought him a pair of shoes he couldn't afford. The other bikers gathered around. Some pulled out their wallets. Others just stared in silence. They didn't need to ask questions. Hunger has a language that doesn't need words. Rafi's voice broke as he added softly, "Mommy hasn't eaten in 2 days. Please, sir." That moment was heavy, like the world itself had paused to listen. The bikers could have simply handed him a few notes and left. But something about this child, this little warrior with a broken bicycle, rooted them to the spot. They decided, in that very moment, that this story would not end in quiet tragedy. The leader of the bikers, Faisal, didn't say a word at first. He just crouched down so he was eye level with the trembling boy. The world around them, the traffic, the honking, the distant chatter, seemed to fade away. All that remained in that moment was a hungry child clutching the last piece of his father's memory and a group of strangers standing at a crossroads between looking away and stepping in. Faisal gently touched the bike's handle, pretending to inspect it, but his real attention was on Rafi's face. The boy's eyes were tired, his lips pale, and his fingers stiff from the cold. This was not the face of someone trying to make a deal. This was the face of someone trying to survive. Without hesitation, Faisal opened his wallet, pulled out a few large bills, and handed them to the boy. But then something shifted among the bikers. What started as one man's kindness turned into a wave. One by one, each biker contributed more money than the bike could ever be worth. In minutes, the small hands of Rafi were holding an amount that made his breath catch in his chest. He stared at it as if it were a dream. It wasn't just the money, it was hope. Pure, unexpected hope. But the bikers weren't done. Faisal looked at the others and simply said, "Let's see where he lives." Rafi hesitated at first. He wasn't used to strangers wanting to help. But when Faisal put a gentle hand on his shoulder and said, "We'll help your mama," the boy's fear melted just enough to let a tear roll down his cheek. He nodded and started leading the way. They walked through narrow streets, stepping over puddles, past faded walls covered in old posters and peeling paint. The air grew colder the deeper they went into the neighborhood. It was a place forgotten by most, a part of the city where dreams often never made it out. Finally, they reached a small room at the end of a crumbling alley. A torn curtain hung at the entrance. Inside, on a thin mattress, lay Amna. Her face was pale, her lips cracked, and her breathing shallow. When she heard footsteps, she tried to sit up, but the weakness in her body didn't allow it. She managed a soft, tired smile as Rafi ran to her side, clutching the money to his chest. "Mama, I sold my bike," he whispered, as though saying it too loud would make it disappear. "We'll buy food now." The bikers stood at the door, taking in the sight. These were men who roared down highways, who lived for the rush of speed, who wore leather jackets and helmets like armor. But at that moment, they stood silently, some with tears burning in their eyes. Because nothing in their fast lives had prepared them for this quiet kind of pain. Without asking for permission, they got to work. One rushed to the nearest store and returned with bags of rice, milk, bread, fruit, and warm blankets. Another made calls to a local clinic. Within an hour, the house that had been filled with the sound of emptiness was filled with life again. The smell of warm food drifted through the air. Rafi sat beside his mother, feeding her spoonfuls of soup, smiling through tears. She held his hand weakly and whispered, "You saved me." But the truth was, he hadn't done it alone. Faisal stepped closer, his voice steady but soft. He told Amna, "Sister, you're not alone anymore." He explained that they would cover her medical treatment and help her find a way to rebuild her life. It wasn't charity, it was humanity. The next few days were like a miracle wrapped in reality. The bikers arranged for Amna to be taken to a clinic where she received proper treatment. They collected funds through their biker group to cover her expenses. Rafi visited her every day, clutching the small photo of his father in his pocket, whispering to himself, "I kept my promise, Papa. I took care of Mama." When she grew stronger, Faisal helped her connect with a small textile workshop that was willing to give her work she could manage from home. She didn't want pity, she wanted dignity. And the bikers respected that. They didn't make her feel like she owed them anything. They made her feel like she belonged. The rusty little bike, the one Rafi had almost sold, was never thrown away. Instead, Faisal had it repaired and returned it to him, shining and smooth, like new. On the day they gave it back, Rafi hugged it tightly, tears streaming down his cheeks. Not because of the bike, but because someone had cared enough to give him back a piece of his father, a piece of himself. Months later, that same alley looked different. Not because the walls had changed, but because hope had moved in. Amna was healthy and working, Rafi was in school, and the bikers still visited, bringing laughter and warmth. Their kindness had not just filled a stomach. It had rebuilt a life. The weeks turned into months, but the memory of that winter morning stayed alive in Rafi's heart. Life had changed in ways he could never have imagined. The alley that had once smelled of damp and despair now echoed with laughter and chatter. Amna was stronger, her face glowing with health, and her hands moved deftly over fabrics as she worked from home. But the true miracle wasn't just survival, it was the belief that someone cared enough to step into their world, into their darkness, without expecting anything in return. Rafi became a boy with purpose. Each morning, he would wake early, go to school with his little repaired bike, and wave at the bikers who often passed by. The once small, timid child had begun to carry himself with quiet confidence. He no longer feared the pangs of hunger or the cold nights. Instead, he dreamed, dared, and hoped. His mother would sometimes watch him, tears brimming, and whisper under her breath, "Thank God for those angels who found us." The bikers themselves changed too. Their act, which had seemed so small in the moment, grew into a ripple of kindness that affected more than just one mother and son. Faisal and his friends started a small initiative in the city, quietly helping children and families who lived on the edges, forgotten by most. Each visit reminded them of Rafi, of the raw, urgent plea that had stopped them in their tracks. "Mommy hasn't eaten in 2 days." They realized that the road was more than asphalt and speed, it was a path to compassion, a route to humanity. One evening, as winter once again crept over the city, Rafi was playing with other children in the alley. He had learned to share the story of his little bike, not to evoke pity, but to teach. Kindness matters, he would say. Even a small act can change everything. Parents passing by would nod, smiling at the sight of a boy who had once been desperate and now radiated hope. Amna, now steady on her feet and cooking a warm meal, often looked out the window at her son. She would silently pray, grateful not only for survival but for the gift of human goodness that had restored their lives. Her heart was full, not just because her child was alive and thriving, but because the world had shown her that compassion still existed. As Rafi grew older, he never forgot those bikers. Each year, he would place flowers near the spot where he had first approached them with his broken bike. That corner, once cold and cruel, became a symbol of hope in his life. The rusty bike had been replaced with a new one, but more importantly, Rafi had inherited something that no money could buy: the belief that goodness exists, and that one can rise even from the deepest despair. Years later, when he became a young man, Rafi returned to the marketplace. He saw other children, scared, hungry, and desperate, clutching broken toys, hoping for a miracle. He knelt down and whispered to them the words that had saved him: "There is hope. There are people who care. You are not alone." And in that moment, he realized that kindness is a chain that never breaks, it only grows. One act, one decision, one gesture of love can change a life forever. The story of Rafi and Amna reminds us that hope can arrive in the form of strangers. That sometimes, the most ordinary people, riding motorcycles through quiet streets, can become the heroes of someone's life. That hunger, despair, and fear can be met with courage, compassion, and love. And that even the smallest hand reaching out in desperation can ignite a wave of change that resonates far beyond a single moment. Sparkling heart, if this story touched your heart, please like, share, and subscribe to Stars of Kindness. Every click spreads hope, every comment spreads love.